Hello everyone, welcome to my channel in my first video. In this channel we're going to talk about books and literature, mainly classics and literature of England. What we're going to start with is a little background, a little history about English literature and where it all began. I mean the roots of what is known today as English literature. So without further introductions, let's start. English literature starts with the Middle Ages. This medieval period in literature extends for more than 800 years, from the oldest known English poem, The Catman's Hymn, at the end of the 7th century, to the Everyman play at the end of the 15th. Now, what we're going to talk about is what happens in between. Historians used to divide the period into two parts: the Old or the Anglo-Saxon English period and the Middle English. The earlier centuries are also called the Dark Ages in order to distinguish their quality with that of the later centuries, which is somehow misleading because the Dark Ages were only relatively dark. These two parts are divided by the conquest of the island in 1066 by the Norman Duke William I, aka William the Conqueror. Now, who were the Anglo-Saxons that the first part is named after them? The Anglo-Saxons were migrants and mercenaries from northern Europe who settled in England in the 5th and 6th centuries. They were the descendants of three different Germanic people: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Those people originally migrated from northern Germany to the island of Britain in the 5th century at the invitation of Vortigern, a ruler of Britons, to help defend his kingdom against marauding invasions by the Picts and Scotti, who occupied what is now known as Scotland. The people of each of the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms spoke distinctive dialects, which evolved over time and together became known as Old English. Within that variety of dialects, an exceptionally rich vernacular literature emerged. The early Germanic society had been organized by families. The head of the family was the chief of his own kinsmen. With the passing of time, more families joined to obey one single chieftain or king. But the number of these so-called bands were high, and most of the time they were short-lived. Thus, long after the Anglo-Saxons were settled in Britain, the island was still broken up into a bewildering number of kingdoms, and a coherent union of all Englishmen was not achieved until the Norman conquest. To the Germanic people, the ideal of kingly behavior was enormously important, and it was perhaps the chief spiritual force behind the civilizations they developed and the creative power that during earlier periods shaped their history and literature. In general terms, we call this the heroic ideal. Put most simply, the heroic ideal was excellency. The hero or the king strove to do better than anyone else the things that an essentially migratory life such as theirs demanded. For example, sailing a ship, swimming in a river, taming a horse, setting firm defenses against enemies, building halls, and most importantly, fighting. This idea was appropriate only to kings, but because society was so closely knit, all the more important male members of the tribe tended to imitate it. It should be noticed that the Germanic society was wholly dominated by males. Women are rarely mentioned in the surviving records of that era, and only if they are, the wives or daughters of kings. While this heroic ideal would win practical success for a king, yet there is another perhaps more important end to achieve for the king or the hero, and that is enduring fame. In cultures whose religion, unlike Christianity, offers no promise of an afterlife, a name that will live on after one's death serves as the closest alternative for immortality. From this arises the heroic paradox still latent in our own civilization that by dying gloriously one may achieve immortality. Now, the poet who could sing the story of his heroic life was, of course, the agent upon whom the hero depended for his fame. And a good poet, or bard, to use the customary term for the poet of heroic life, was a valued member of a primitive court. The poetic form which early bards evolved for their heroic narratives is called epic. It is characterized by a solemn dignity of tone and elevation of style. The chief surviving epic from the Germanic culture is the Old English poem Beowulf. Thus, the immortality that the kings and old heroes had sought was achieved through poetry, and poetry in turn gave inspiration to later men in leading their own lives. The reason why most of the poems of the time have been lost is because they were not written and were recited aloud from the bard's memories. Whatever literary materials the Anglo-Saxons brought with them when they came to Britain existed only in their memories, for the making of written records was something they learned only when they were converted to Christianity. The Celtic inhabitants whose land they were seizing were Christians, as had been the Romans whose forces had occupied the island since the 1st century and whose withdrawal at the beginning of the 5th had opened the way to the Anglo-Saxons. For 150 years after the beginning of the invasion, Christianity was maintained only in the remoter regions where the Anglo-Saxons failed to penetrate. However, in the year 597, Saint Augustine was sent by Pope Gregory as a missionary to King Ethelbert of Kent, and about the same time missionaries from the island began to preach Christianity in the north. Within 75 years, the island was once more predominantly Christian. In the following centuries, until the Norman conquest, England produced a large number of highly literate churchmen, one of which was Bede, also known as the Venerable Bede, who was one of the greatest scholars of the Anglo-Saxon period. He produced a large number of works on subjects as varied as science, music, poetry, and biblical commentary, but he is most famous for his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, one of our best written sources for early English history. For this reason, Bede is sometimes regarded as the father of English history. Beside him, there were other saints, and thus by the year 800 English culture had developed so richly that it overflowed its limited boundaries. The greatest impetus of English culture, however, came from a man who was not of the clergy. Alfred the King was king of the West Saxons from 871 to 899, who for a time united all the kingdoms of southern England and beat off those new Germanic invaders, the Vikings. This most active king was an enthusiastic patron of literature. He himself translated various works from Latin. Under Alfred's direction, Bede's history was also translated into Old English, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was begun. It was a year-by-year record of important events in England and was maintained until the middle of the 12th century. The preservation of many of their surviving earlier English works, including Beowulf, is due to the fact that copies were made in the West Saxon dialect because of the impetus Alfred gave to literary studies. Now let's take a look at Old English poetry. Since in many respects Christian and heroic ideas are antipathetic, it is natural that very little poetry has survived that is purely pre-Christian in composition. Although much of Beowulf, along with several other pieces of fragments, are pre-Christian composition and reflect the pagan period without any Christian coloring, yet the vast bulk of Old English poetry is specifically Christian and devoted to religious subjects. Interestingly enough, however, it is almost all in the heroic mode. In order to make the alien world of the Bible intelligible for their hearers, Old English poets infused Christianity with many of the values that they had inherited from their own history. For a few examples, Moses and Saint Andrew, Christ and God the Father share the attributes of a Beowulf, and they are represented as heroes who performed famous deeds. In Cadman's hymn, the creation of heaven and earth is seen as a mighty deed, and the characteristic of a heroic spirit in two Christian laments, the Wanderer and the Seafarer, are all examples of how Christian and heroic values were combined to make Old English literature. To a modern reader, the world of Old English poetry is a narrow one with narrow laws. Romantic love hardly appears at all, and heroes and warriors are always clothed in armors and prepared to test their might against their fate and the forces of evil. But this might change after the Norman invasion, which will be explained in my next video. That's it for today, guys. Thank you for watching and putting up with my voice in your ears. I hope it didn't bother you. And it's a bit early to ask for a call to action. I mean, I'm just a regular man with zero experience on YouTube, right? But feel free if you want to subscribe. See you guys in the next video. Peace.